Welcome back to another edition of A Scribe's Journey with your host, Richard Paulinelli. A Scribe's Journey is brought to you in part by Tuscany Bay Books. If you're a new author and you've just typed the words "the end" on your manuscript, now you're asking yourself, what do I do next? The people at Tuscany Bay Books are here to help you get your book out and get you paid. Reach out to them at tuscanybaybooks.com or blackdogpublishing.co. Okay, everybody, welcome to another week of A Scribe's Journey, and we're doing things a little different this week. Usually we kind of have a lead in and then we go to our guest after a message, but we just keep you on your toes. We're gonna go straight to the show. So before we do, I want to welcome all of our new followers and listeners on iHeartRadio, because we are now showing up on that podcast broadcaster, which is really nice, because if you can't take the time to watch us, but you've got a device that you can take with you, you can certainly listen to our guest and some of the wonderful books and some of the interesting stories they have to tell us. This week, we've got a really good guest, and this is a case from back in the 1980s. You may remember the McMartin preschool trials that took place out in Los Angeles County. It was I think it's safe to say, the trial of the century for about 10 years, and then O.J. Simpson said, "Hold my beer." And that was the end of a lot of the publicity toward this case kind of got sucked out by the O.J. trial. And we have an author today who, along with his writing partner, has spent over 3 decades pretty closely following this trial in this case. And we're going to talk to him a little bit about it and about the book they wrote. So let us bring him in by reading his bio. In the spring of 1987, Matthew Leroy and Deric Haddad, I don't know if I got that right, began researching the McMartin case. They had an inside track because his mother and stepfather were experts on the topic of child sexual abuse and had been hired as defense consultants. In January 1988, they left college, San Diego State, moved up to Los Angeles to attend the trial and conduct an investigation in Manhattan Beach, which is where they discovered an amazing story, a modern-day crucible eerily similar to the tragic events of Salem in 1692. Eventually, they obtained the lost archives of Judy Johnson, the mother who instigated the case. She was a paranoid schizophrenic whose untimely death led many to speculate that the truth would be forever lost. Now, 30 years later, their book, They Must Be Monsters, reveals a never-before-seen side of this case, authentic documents and testimony that finally reconciles the truth behind the McMartin preschool trial. And we will welcome Deric to the show. And I am not going to mess up your last name any further. So from now on, it's Deric. Deric, welcome aboard.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I'm usually better with last names. It's just, I'll blame it on the fact we had tornadoes yesterday and we got another thunderstorm coming through now. So
I have no trouble saying Paleonelli.
Oh, okay. All right. See, just there you go. All right. So basically, Deric, you and Matthew kind of took an interest in this case. So why don't you kind of tell us a little bit about the McMartin preschool trial for those who don't remember it or who vaguely remember it, because it has been quite some time.
Right. When you talk about McMartin, it's really good, I'm learning, to talk about it from the public's perception. So when I talk about McMartin, it's nice to start the case on February 2nd, 1984, which was when Wayne Satz of KABC TV broadcast the case on local television, and it became a nationwide sensation over a matter of a few months. It went from one man and his mother, Ray Buckey and Peggy Buckey, as teachers at the McMartin preschool, to 7 teachers being indicted in a massive conspiracy. And what unfolded from there was really a witch hunt across the community, where about 8 preschools were shut down and dozens of people were implicated. But it's really taking a step back to about 6 to 7 months prior, when the first allegation came about, and seeing how in the community of Manhattan Beach, this really started to snowball into that hysteria that set the stage for this case. The case was started by a woman named Judy Johnson. who was later to be determined paranoid schizophrenic. The problem was at the time, she seemed believable to the community around her. The police believed her enough to send out a letter to 200 families, asking them to question their children about whether or not they had been sexually abused at the school years prior. All the children originally said, no, I wasn't abused. Because they didn't get the information out of the children they wanted, they started sending the children to a special institute to be interviewed by therapists. And from there, they amassed a volume of videotaped interviews of children disclosing their abuse. The problem was the district attorney never viewed the videotapes. Once the second district attorney, Ira Reiner, took the case over, he actually viewed the tapes and realized that the evidence was incredibly weak. It didn't go beyond the mere accusation, as he put it. It was just children on video nodding and saying, yes, I was abused. But by that time, the entire witch hunt had taken hold of the community, and there was really no going back.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy that you're using, because it, I've read part of the book, haven't read all of it, but being familiar with what happened back in Salem, you can't help but immediately think of the Salem witch trials, what was going on back then, because it's just the same thing, just all over again. One person says one thing and it just takes off, and all of a sudden it's not the truth. It's, what you want the story to be.
Right. I mean, the term witch hunt today is used more in a political sense by people who feel they're falsely accused, and they're decrying injustice by saying it's a witch hunt. What was so interesting about what occurred in Manhattan Beach in the early 80s was it was truly not only a witch hunt, but eerily similar to Salem, where you had children being used as vehicles to make these fantastical, sensational claims, really prompted by adults who had ulterior motives to make these claims, just like in Salem. You had the parallels between puritanical fear of witchcraft and the 1980s satanic panic and the scare of Satanism. And then you really had progressive societies that had this fear of the unknown. They really didn't know what they were dealing with, and things spun out of control. They really thought, the society thought they were ahead of the game on this. They really thought, with all their psychotherapy and this new age way of thinking, that they had their finger on the pulse of this, but they were so wrong and so misguided in what they did.
Now, I think people can jump on and Google if they want to know, so we're not doing spoilers here. How did this end as far as the trial itself for the?
Right. You said to me earlier about the 30 years. It'll actually be in January of 2020 will be the 30-year anniversary of the first verdict, which was the majority of the charges were dropped with a handful of a hung jury, like 13 counts hung. And then 6 months later, in July of 1990, they had the second trial, which was about, I think, 9 counts, and all those ended in a hung jury. So the case, it's the longest, most expensive criminal domestic case in U.S. history that ended in a hung jury. So there's really still a lot of people out there wondering what the hell ever happened at the McMartin preschool. And that's what I think we try to get into the bottom of.
Now, you mentioned Ira Reiner when he looked at the videotapes.
Right.
And he realized that the kids could not be relied on as witnesses in this thing, because they clearly had been coached. I think that's a pretty easy statement. Why did he proceed then if the key witnesses weren't there? Was he at a point with the office where we've invested so much into this, we got to keep going?
I think that's it. I mean, it was the McMartin 7, which was Ray Buckey, his mother Peggy Buckey, his sister Peggy Ann Buckey, his grandmother Virginia McMartin, and then 3 other teachers, Betty Rader, Babette Spittler, and Mary Ann Jackson, were the McMartin 7. When he dropped after an 18-month preliminary hearing, which ended in December of 1985, where all 7 people were told they were going to be standing trial in a superior court. A month later, in January of '86, Ira Reiner dropped charges against 5 of the 7, saying that the evidence was incredibly weak and that they didn't go beyond the mere accusation. The evidence against the 5 who he dropped was exactly the same as the evidence against the 2 he continued with. So it certainly was kind of a CYA. We have too much invested into this. We can't just say nothing happened. So we're just going to say that some children were abused and that we made a mistake by carrying this, by making this into the case of the century when it really wasn't.
Right.
But something happened here. We couldn't be this foolish to think that nothing happened.
Right. So I mean, would it be safe to say that he found 2 out of the 7 that he thought he had a shot at convicting and went with those 2?
I just think it was very political in the sense of you had an entire community of parents, people, prosecutors, advocates, all of society, who they built up this story. They built up this story that they must be monsters, which is why we called the book that. They created this, the irony of it was that they made these people into monsters because only monsters would have done these horrible crimes. This wasn't just child molestation. This was killing and mutilating animals to scare children into silence, you making them do drugs, the allegations were beyond belief. So I think the only way to move forward was we have to say that something occurred. Really, Ira Reiner, to his credit, really wasn't responsible for this case. His predecessor, Robert Philibosian, who was a non-elected district attorney. He was elected to the position after John Vandekamp, who was DA, became the Attorney General of California. This Board of Supervisors appointed Robert Philibosian. He was not a popularly elected politician, and he had a special election in June of '84. The indictments were in March of '84. 3 months later, he had a special election against Reiner, which he lost. So Reiner really inherited the case, and by the time he got his hands on it and really got his hands around it, he realized this is a nightmare. This is spiraling downhill.
Yeah, and on top of that, no sooner does Ira navigate his way through the McMartin trial, he's got the Rodney King mess on his hands. So he did not have a very good run as DA in Los Angeles County. I think that's safe to say.
He had a tough go, and I think he was. I don't know the inner workings of it, but it seems like I definitely think there was some political infighting too, but probably between him and his chief deputy Gil Garcetti at the time, who ended up becoming the DA after Reiner. And I think they were together on the McMartin case, but I'm sure he took over his job, so I'm sure they couldn't have been great friends.
Yeah, and I'm sure Gil Garcetti's like, finally I've got the job, and then OJ did what?
Yeah, right, yeah. Exactly.
So Ira Reiner and Gil Garcetti did not come out of the McMartin trial in good shape at all, and it only got worse for Garcetti.
But I do give them credit. They at least tried to step up and keep it within reason. But really, what they should have done is they should have just dropped the entire case and taken the political lumps and moved on, because they wasted another probably $6-7 million, and another year and a half of people's lives got ruined while they ran through the trial. Actually, no, 3 years. Three. They dropped the charges in January of dropped charges against 507 in January of '86. It didn't end until January of '90. So 4 more years it went on after they knew they had a weak case.
Our justice system at work here in this country, it's scary sometimes. If you get in the wrong situation in the wrong county, it can be a nightmare.
Absolutely.
So now you and Matthew, let's get into this aspect of it. You're college students at San Diego State, and this thing breaks open. What drew you to this case to the point where you actually, if I remember the bio right, you left San Diego State and moved to LA specifically to track this thing? Yeah,
my background was pretty deep. My mother and stepfather were experts in the topic of child sexual abuse. My stepfather had started the Child Sexual Assault Division as a detective for the Los Angeles Police Department. My mother was a victim's advocate. So I really grew up seeing the reality of pedophilia and child molestation, of what victims go through, and knew that the majority of the children that were sexually abused, that it happened in the home, usually by somebody the child knew. Normally pedophiles were people that, as sick as it may sound, actually in their mind felt that they loved children and were just, it was part of their seduction, and it was a real sickness, but it was really prevalent in society in the late 70s. And that the education and the awareness of the crime, I think, spawned an overreaction of what we saw with McMartin. But long story short, my stepdad and mother had retired, I would say, in the early 80s, and around the spring of 1985, Danny Davis, Ray Bucky's attorney, approached them and said, I want you to investigate this case. I want you to try to, a rhetorical challenge, I want you to try to prove my client guilty. And if you prove him guilty, I won't defend him. But if you can't prove him guilty, I want you to testify on his behalf. So they spent the next year and a half studying the case inside and out. They studied all those transcripts from the children's interviews, police reports, a lot of confidential information that the public hadn't seen. And they had formed the opinion that Ray Bucky and Peggy Bucky were innocent, and that all of the teachers were innocent. I couldn't get access to the kind of information they had, but their opinions alone of what they said, to me, that in their opinion they were innocent and that it was a witch hunt. But what they told Matt and I was that if you really want to investigate this and look into this case, you have to go into the community. The truth won't be found in the courtroom. The courtroom is going to be a bunch of motions and testimony where people are dodging questions. The truth is still alive in the community of Manhattan Beach, where this crucible occurred. And if you want to get to the truth, you have to get to Judy Johnson. Let me take a quick step back. My first discussion with my stepdad and mom was on Christmas Eve, 1986. And it was about 11 months after Ira Reiner had dropped charges against 5 of the 7. A week prior, Judy Johnson, the mother who made the initial accusation in the case, had been found dead in her home. So 1 week after she died was the first conversation I had with them about her. And she was truly the mystery of the case. And when they said to me, Deric, the whole case really rests in her story, I said, well, what's the deal with her? And they said, well, they just found her dead in her home. So the truth may forever be lost. But if you could investigate what happened in her life, you'll probably find the truth to what happened. So that's when Matt and I started studying the case. We spent about a year studying every article on the case before moving to Manhattan Beach to actually chase the trial in real time. The trial began in the summer of '87. We had already been studying the articles on the case for about 6 months. And by January of '88, we took our first trip to Manhattan Beach and started interviewing people and decided, if we're going to go after this story, we have to get it now. And really, not to bore you to death with these kind of details, but in studying Salem at the time as college students, we were studying Salem. We were studying Arthur Miller's The Crucible. And we were seeing that some of the challenges with Salem and also with The Crucible was that they all were taking historical records of 300 years old of what actually occurred in Salem. So there was so much supposition or speculation over what actually happened, but nobody really knew what happened. They had stories of what they believed, this kind of folklore, where they were putting together pieces of archives to try to reach conclusions. And we said to ourselves, you know what? This is still fresh. This is what we think is the phenomenon that occurred in this community. We think it is a modern-day crucible, a modern-day witch hunt, eerily similar to Salem. And if we can capture this information now, we can document this. And who knows, maybe 20 or 30 years later, we'll be able to come out with something that actually sheds light and reconciles the truth. And ultimately, that's what we did. To cut to the chase, we ended up, after about a year of negotiating and befriending Judy Johnson's father, the deceased woman's father, he ended up giving us a garbage bag full of her notes and diaries, which within that context of this garbage bag, this hefty bag full of notes and diaries and letters, we're able to trace her schizophrenic pattern back prior to her associating herself with the McMartin preschool, prior to her making the accusation, and we're actually able to piece together the truth behind what was going through her mind at the time, which sparked this mass hysteria. So it really does, in our book, we're able to actually produce authentic documentation for the first time that reveals the truth and reconciles history to the nation's largest case. It really is, I think, an extraordinary story.
Yeah, well, short of having the person themselves, if they wrote that much and put that much paper down, They had to offer just this huge picture window to look into and get a feel for who she was and why she did what she did.
Right, and why it's so germane to the case was that once she died, she was ruled irrelevant in a pretrial hearing because the defense was trying to have the case thrown out because she was the first person to initiate the case, and if the entire case was falsified, then she was that seminal misleading event which caused this to occur. But they ruled her irrelevant to the case. Legally, they made the right choice. They said, we have hundreds of other families who have said they've been abused. If she's dead, one witness is dead, it doesn't mean the other people don't have the right to be heard in court. So we're ruling her irrelevant. But what our book definitely shows is how relevant she was. And without being a spoiler, what we ultimately do in the book is we go back and we show exactly what led to her association with the preschool. And it kind of proves from the very get-go that she was misguided.
Yeah, it seems like a strange ruling. I mean, legally it's probably correct, but it's like saying the match that you struck is irrelevant to the forest you burned down when you struck the match.
Right.
I don't know. Anyway, you talk about the book, and I have a copy which you sent me, and I appreciate that very much.
You and me both. And it's dueling copies.
It's thick. So if you want to know. There's a lot of good stuff in there. If you want to know what happened, go get the book, which is the whole, go get it. Now, when exactly did you two decide, okay, we've reached that point? I've written 2 nonfiction, and it took me 2 years on. Well, it took me 2 years on one. Technically, from the time I started researching the first one to the time I wrote, it took about 15 years. Right. At what point did you guys hit that point where you go, okay, we have what we need. Let's write it.
We hung up our gloves in, let's say 90, 91. I went back to, Matt was 4 years older than me. I was 19 when we started our research. He was 23. He was just getting out of college. I was just getting into college. So after the case ended and I went back to finish school and he went to get a job and support himself, we spent several years trying to make something work. But, life just gets in the way sometimes. And when you're that age, you just have to go get a job and you have to support yourself. And I could read to you the letters from some of these publishers that we had a good agent, and we submitted to publishers, and publishers came back to us basically saying, if this is what you say it is, then this should certainly be in the hands of someone more qualified than 2 dumb college kids. It was like, ouch, wow, we're really losers. So and then before you know it, you fall in love and get married and have kids, and you're on your way into life, and life just takes another courses. And so, but in 2014. February of 14, Matt called me on the phone. Matt did a tremendous job of archiving the database that he has is amazing. It's off the charts. So he really did a great job of archiving and preserving the information. He called me up and says, let's get this thing done. Let's get this thing written. So between February of 2014 and February of 2014, the first draft was written. It was a 218,000 word first draft, really clean, really well written, but extremely academic, a lot of dates, a lot of quotes, really journalistic. But that was under the working title, The Last Crucible. And we called it The Last Crucible because we felt it was the last prominent crucible in American history ever, with, let's say, McCarthyism being the last crucible. We really felt that in the 1980s, this McMartin hysteria was last crucible. That didn't go over great with a lot of our beta readers. They felt it sounded more like something about the Crusades, and it kind of. I still liked the title. I thought it was a great working title, and I think that we created that crucible in the book. But we ended up changing the title eventually. We went through numerous rewrites, trying to cut a 218,000 word book down to what it should be, which is now it's 110,000 words. It's still thick at 110,000 words. But this last version in the summer of 17, I think it was, really, it really came to us where we took it from being more of an academic book. And as you know, you've read some of it, it reads more like a novel. It's more like a story, because it really was a story about a community of people that got caught up in something. And it was about people and about their fear and their anxiety. And now that I'm a 51-year-old man with an 18, 17, and 14-year-old kids, I know what it would be like if somebody told me my kid was abused. But when I was 19 years old, I didn't have a clue. I was gathering information because I thought people were wronged and falsely accused. So aggressively, we were gathering information. And I probably was pretty aggressive in getting the information. I'm glad I did. But I do have a better understanding now of what those parents went through. Even though I feel they were wrong, I feel that they were misguided. And, you know, if an expert told me my kid was sexually abused, I would want to go kill somebody.
Yeah.
I hate to say it. That's just what I would want to do. So I have a lot more empathy for the parents now. But no, this last version of the book that you have in your hand it just flowed. It just said, we need to be able to take these 10 pages and turn it into one page and just tell the story.
Yeah.
You know, and that first version, you know, you're a writer, so you at first you don't I can't cut out these 10 pages of work I did, you know. So you just but then it gets to the point where you want to publish a book and you want people to read your book.
Yeah.
So it becomes easier to say, okay, well, I'm not throwing it away forever. I'm just going to save a new file and start deleting stuff. And you know, I've always got that 280,000 word version there, but I can't publish an 800-page book. No one's going to buy an 800-page book. So
no, that's a little, for today's reader, that's a little long. It's a little long.
Right.
Yeah, I remember the first book I had traditionally published, which is that one over my top of my head there, and the first edits came back, and I was fighting tooth and nail over every word, and I finally realized, okay, you can fight this. They'll bail on you, and that book will never see a bookshelf. So you know, what hill are you wanting to die on here? Right. As a writer, you will eventually learn, okay, this one's important, this one not so much, this one whatever. You know, right. You just got to get to that point.
That's it.
Are you two planning on doing any further research, any further books on this case, or is this it? I mean,
we certainly have enough info. We had to cut out major storylines just to make this. There was other storylines we cut out. We are thinking of doing more. We always we didn't actually even tell our story in this. I had about 50,000 words where we actually told our story of how we got involved and how we came across the information. But at a certain point, it kind of, if you read this book, you'll see in the end of the book, the last 2 chapters, we condense it down and kind of bring in our final part of our investigation of what we did. We could certainly do another book where we really get more in depth in our story, but I just felt like it was such a distraction to the real story. What occurred in that community was so phenomenal, and it needed to be told on its own, that we felt when we were trying to tell our story, it was getting in the way of the important story. Right. So, but there's so many other cases and so many things we could approach that. Right now, we're just trying to do justice to trying to market and tell this story and let people know about it. So,
all right. So we are coming up to kind of the end of the show here. So we need to let people know where we can find you and Matthew online, and where they can find your book.
Sure. The website is theymustbemonsters.com. You can read more about the case there. You can order the book online from there. We're getting the book in several Barnes & Noble stores, depending on where you're at. We've had some tremendous book signings. In fact, the Barnes & Nobles in Manhattan Beach, where the community where it took place, put us in their recommended section, which we really appreciated. But you can buy the book on Amazon.com, BarnesandNobles.com. You can get it in hardback, softback, or electronic format.
Excellent. Well, Deric, thank you for coming on and sharing. I wish we had more time to have you go through this. 'Cause, like I said, just remembering what I remembered from my young journalistic days back in the late 80s. This was quite a story back then, and I think you guys have captured it quite nicely in your book, and kind of let us know exactly what was going on and how a lot of people got wronged. And it's amazing that it spread to other schools. It wasn't just this one school. Once it started at one, it just shot out.
And you can if you Google daycare, preschool, sex hysteria, you'll see that it went all over the nation.
Yeah,
it went all over the nation. So it really was like a national kind of almost epidemic of false accusations. So
yeah. It was quite the story. If you weren't around, if you weren't alive back then, it was something to sit back and watch.
Well, and I really appreciate your time. Be on the lookout for us too. We are right now in the process of negotiating a 6-part documentary series. I can't say who it's with, but don't be surprised if you see us out there in the next year or so.
Excellent. Okay. Well, if that comes to fruition, give me a holler and I will mention it here on the show. Make sure you people who watch this know it's coming up.
Okay, I really
we,
appreciate your time. Thank you.
hey, thanks for coming on. We're going to go ahead and cut it right now. Next week's guest is Tom Tinney and his son Morgan Batten. They've got a pretty interesting story about how father and son met for the first time, and the book that came out of that meeting. So we'll see you guys here next week. And in the meantime, readers keep reading, writers keep writing, and keep walking the path of a scribe's journey. We'll see you next time.